Hi, welcome to the GRE Verbal Section. This is probably the section of the GRE that is most familiar to our test prep education instructors, although it may have changed since the last time you looked at the exam. It was updated in 2011. They replaced analogies and antonyms with what we call sentence equivalents. So now there are three basic question types. These are text completion, reading comprehension, and sentence equivalence. The writing is addressed in a separate video. So the parts of the test, text completion and reading comprehension, are still very familiar, fill in the blank and reading question types. Be sure to review the basic strategies for each of the question types in your given textbooks and emphasize the importance of choosing your own word for both text completion and sentence equivalence. The kinds of fill in the blank type questions you're going to see, plus emphasize the idea of finding evidence in reading comprehension passages. Some of the reading comprehension questions are in a special category called critical reasoning, and these require some rudimentary logical analysis. So you should have the students review the structure of logical arguments, premises, and conclusions, as well as the most basic inductive logical structures, analogical arguments or analogies, statistical arguments where you reason from a sample to a larger group, and causal arguments where either you're attempting to identify the cause of some effect or a way to consistently generate the same effects usually. So the three types of questions: text completion has 1, 2, or 3 blanks. It never comes with partial credit, and there are about 6 questions in both verbal sections. Sentence equivalence has 1 blank, and it always requires exactly 2 correct answers. Again, there's no partial credit, and there are about 4 of these in every verbal section. There are 2 verbal sections. And then lastly, reading comprehension comes with 1 to 5 paragraphs that may be associated with 1 up to 5 questions concerning that text. And that makes up fully half of each verbal section. That's 10 questions for a total of 20 reading comprehension questions over the course of the exam. And this is why I actually split critical reasoning questions, and I teach those on a separate day from the rest of the reading comprehension practice, because I want to make sure students get as much exposure to reading comprehension as possible. There are 3 types of answers on the verbal section as well. These are the single answer multiple choice, and the buttons always come in a circle. Then there are the select all that apply, where 1 or more correct answers are possible, and again, there's no partial credit. And instead of circle buttons, they will have little square boxes that they will check. And then lastly, select a sentence is a type of answer on the verbal section where they will actually use their mouse to click on the correct sentence in the passage, On the standardized exams that we use for our midterm and final, it will instead ask the student to identify the sentence by which number it is. Is it sentence number 1, sentence 2, sentence 3? That'll be how we'll have them do it, since we don't have the functionality to allow them to click on the sentence. About memorizing vocabulary, it's still largely a vocabulary test, the verbal section, especially for non-native English speakers. So you can tell them all of this, but be measured with how much you frighten them with the English language. Just encourage them. The goal is to be nurturing, right? So you might remind them that a lot of these are true about other languages as well. I think Mandarin has a number of words comparable to the English language, and in Mandarin, some people study for decades and they still don't know the whole language. I certainly don't know the entirety of the English language, and I'm very well read. So be sure they know those facts as well. The English language does have over 1 million words. Only about 170,000 are currently in use, and college graduates are usually in about the range of a vocabulary of 20,000 words. Now, really, this is far too many words to expect anybody to memorize. But English does also have roots in other languages, and the basic simplest words in English usually have Germanic roots, whereas the intellectual sounding academic jargon that we usually use has Greek and Latin roots, usually. Greek and Latin roots and affixes, prefixes and suffixes. So test makers are going to tend to prefer obscure words with Greek and Latin roots, that you do not need exact definitions to fill in the word in a blank. And roots, having your roots memorized will be very useful for improving your process of elimination, which is going to be one of our primary tools on the verbal section. Other ways to improve vocabulary include reading as much as possible. I encourage students to look at the genres they like best, whether it's news media, fantasy and science fiction, comic books, mysteries, philosophy, whatever it is they love reading, whatever subjects they are passionate about, encourage them to read in English, any texts you know that pertain to those subjects. Also tell them to take notes. They should keep a list of words to look up and add to their stack of flashcards for their vocabulary. Tell them to actually read on paper, if at all possible, because it affects the brain and seems to help the memory work better if you encounter it not just on a digital screen, but also in a physical book. Handwriting and reading with your eyes on paper, for some reason, helps trigger the brain. I think it's something about muscle memory. This was a cool tip that I thought was very useful. Develop mnemonic devices for very difficult words, such as little stories or tools that'll help you remember the meaning. Greg is gregarious. He's a sociable, friendly guy. Hi, Greg, you're gregarious. And if you say it multiple times like that, it's more likely to stick in the brain. Flashcards are your best friend. It's better on paper, but even digital flashcards are better than nothing. And they work best when you make your own. I just take a regular 3x5 index card and I cut them in half so that I get 2 out of every index card, 2 flashcards, and I carry them around held together by a rubber band whenever I'm learning a new subject. Then you triage. You have the words that you know. You can skip those. Take those out of your deck. As soon as you know them, they can stop being in your deck. The words that you kind of know, and those are the ones that you really want to focus on memorizing repeatedly, and the words that you don't really know at all, which need to be incorporated as you get more familiar with words and they move out of the second group. So whenever the words in those second and third groups become familiar, move them over to the first group and just keep on practicing daily until those groups shrink down. Add new words as you encounter them. And of course, use those roots and affixes, memorize them. There are lists you can provide to the students. They can also go research their own. Another strategy recommended is to group synonyms into lists together. So if you have a bunch of words that all have to do with medicine or with something being healthy or positive, these are all different categories that'll be useful. And if you look at the back of the Kaplan GRE book, there's an appendix in there with synonym group lists and with root group lists, if I'm not mistaken. I also encourage students learning vocabulary to try to use multiple senses. Again, linguists say that you need 8 genuine, authentic encounters with a word to really learn it. So encourage them to make up a little song and then sing it, to have them write sentences, have them write poetry, have them create little drawings or a gesture. I always use elevate, and I lift my hand, elevate. One of our instructors encourages for syllable emphasis. A little 1-2 punch sometimes is helpful for them to get the pronunciation right. Something physical can be useful, gestures and movements, but to use as many senses as possible and encounter the brain with that word from as many different directions, the student's going to be more likely to remember it. Tell them to practice it on everybody and anybody, and to use other languages to help them remember the words. Sometimes even a false cognate can be a useful mnemonic device. And then there are numerous online resources, IXL, Free Rice, Townsend Press for the vocabulary textbook for GRE Verbal 1, Advancing Word Power has a really good website. And then this is the website where I created the spreadsheet that has the roots to memorize from. All right, I've got 10 minutes left, or 5 minutes left to talk about the specifics. Reading comprehension is really the open book part of the test. They have to go look for evidence in the passage. And we'll talk in a later video maybe about what that mapping the passage is like. It is described in detail in the textbook, but present it and model that process to your students, as well as the strategies of reading all answer choices, not falling for a partially correct answer. A half right answer is all wrong, is something I like to tell my students. To pay close attention to context and to look carefully for those select all that apply where you will have multiple correct answers sometimes. For text completion, the most important strategy is they need to try to fill the blank with their own word before they look at the answers, and then they need to read all of the answer choices to look for the closest matches there. If there are multiple blanks, to fill in whichever blank is the easiest. It's not always the first one. And they need to then read the sentence to themselves silently to make sure it makes sense before they submit their answer. With the sentence equivalence section, it's again, you have to have exactly 2 answers, and it's not always synonyms, but it is always 2 words that will make 2 sentences that are more or less similar in meaning. The sentences have equivalent values. So it has to make sense. It has to have an equivalent meaning. It requires them to read the whole sentence. You're going to look for clues and structural indicators such as, I think the Kaplan Books calls it same direction, opposite direction, or maybe that's the Princeton book. I forget. And again, they need to try to come up with their own word to fill in the blank and look for words that are similar in value to that word. Finally, double checking their answers. So I'll stop this video there. The next one will be about the GMAT verbal section.